Vanish by Barron Darby. Chapter 11. Olivia, the Monday after the flight. The Monday after the flight arrived with a dull, grey heaviness that seemed to settle over everything, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath. Olivia moved through her shift with a constant prickling awareness crawling along her skin. The unmistakable sensation that she was being watched, even when no one stood behind her. Every clang of a pan, every burst of laughter from the bar, every sudden movement in her peripheral vision made her shoulders tighten and her pulse spike just a little higher. She caught herself glancing toward the door more often than she needed to, half expecting Paolo to walk in, to lean against the frame with that quiet, dangerous calm that never needed to announce itself. By the time her shift ended, her nerves were stretched thin, and she asked one of the cooks, someone big, someone steady, to walk her out to her car, her voice casual, but her eyes betraying the urgency beneath. It didn't stop at work, though, and that was what made it worse, what made it feel like there was no place left that belonged to her anymore. The fear followed her home, slipped through the cracks of her front door, and settled into the quiet spaces of her apartment, where it had no business being. Nights became something she endured rather than rested through, her sleep shallow and broken, every creak of the floorboards or distant sound outside snapping her awake like a wire pulled too tight. She would lie there for a moment, heart racing, listening, convincing herself it was nothing before inevitably getting up anyway, padding barefoot across the floor to check the locks for the second or third time. The routine became automatic, almost ritualistic, as if repeating it enough might somehow keep the danger at bay. The bat beside her bed felt like a hollow comfort, its worn grip familiar beneath her hand but ultimately useless against the reality she couldn't ignore. Paolo wasn't just another guy. He carried himself with a kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly how far he could push things and how little resistance he would meet. She had seen the way he moved, the way he sized people up without appearing to, and she knew, deep down, that if it ever came down to it, a bat wouldn't change the outcome. And then there were the texts, those carefully timed messages that felt less like communication and more like calculated reminders of what he was capable of. The images of his target practice lingered in her mind long after she put the phone down, each one sharpening the edge of her fear until it became something she could no longer ignore. That was the moment everything shifted, when the weight of it all pressed down too hard to carry. Alone. Olivia sat on the edge of her bed that morning, phone in hand, her thoughts racing as she tried to figure out who she could turn to without making things worse. Her mind moved quickly through the familiar names, dismissing each one almost as soon as it surfaced, not because they didn't care, but because they wouldn't understand what this required. Chanel was gone, wrapped up in her own world with someone Olivia didn't fully trust, and her absence felt sharper now than it ever had before. Her mother would unravel under the pressure, her worry turning into panic that would only complicate things further, while her younger brothers, kind and gentle as they were, lived in a reality far removed from the kind of confrontation Paolo represented. Her co-workers and friends from around town felt just as distant in a different way, their lives moving along familiar, predictable paths that had no room for something like this. Olivia knew instinctively that involving them would only pull them into something they weren't prepared for, something they would rather avoid if they understood it fully. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that they didn't live in a world where problems like this were solved directly, decisively, without hesitation. That realization left her with a single name, one that carried a very different kind of weight, one that came with both reassurance and a quiet, unspoken understanding of what asking for help would actually mean. Raven. The name alone brought a strange sense of relief, as if just thinking it had already shifted the balance slightly in her favor. Raven was the kind of person who didn't flinch, who didn't hesitate, who didn't second-guess herself when things got complicated or dangerous. Olivia had seen it firsthand, watched her step into situations that would make most people turn the other way, handling them with a calm efficiency that made it clear she wasn't guessing or hoping. She knew exactly what she was doing. There was something almost unsettling about the breadth of her. Connections. The way she could make things happen without explaining how. The way doors opened for her in places most people didn't even know existed. Olivia didn't let herself overthink it once the decision settled into place, dialing Raven's number before she could talk herself out of it. The line rang only once before Raven's voice came through, bright and immediate, cutting through the tension that had been building all morning. "Olivia," she said, the warmth in her tone both familiar and grounding, and for a moment, Olivia felt the tightness in her chest loosen, just enough to breathe. Hearing her name spoken like that, without judgment or hesitation, made everything she had been, holding back, come rushing forward all at once. "Raven," Olivia replied, her voice catching slightly before she steadied it, trying to keep control as she began to explain. The words tumbled out faster than she could organize them, each sentence overlapping the next, as she tried to convey the urgency of the situation without losing the details that mattered. She told her about Chanel leaving, about Paolo's behavior shifting from unsettling to outright threatening, about the messages and the images, and the constant sense that something was building just beneath the surface. By the time she finished, she realized she hadn't taken a full breath in what felt like minutes. Her chest rising and falling unevenly as the silence on the other end stretched just long enough to make her wonder what Raven was thinking. When Raven finally spoke, her voice had changed, the warmth still there but layered now with something sharper, more focused. She mentioned having heard about Paolo before, her tone carrying a familiarity that made Olivia's stomach tighten in a different way, as if pieces of a larger picture were falling into place without her fully understanding them. "I've got you covered," Raven said, the certainty in her words leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. "Just text me his address, and it will be dealt with." The simplicity of it should have been reassuring, and in a way it was, but it also carried an undercurrent that made Olivia pause, her mind briefly jumping to possibilities she wasn't sure she wanted to consider. "What will you do?" Olivia asked, the question slipping out before she could filter it, her voice quieter now, edged with a nervous curiosity she couldn't quite suppress. Raven's response came quickly, almost dismissively calm, as if the details weren't something Olivia needed to concern herself with. "Don't worry," she said, her tone steady and unwavering. "He will never bother you again." There was a finality in the way she said it, something absolute that settled into Olivia's thoughts with a weight she couldn't ignore, even as part of her wanted to. Raven went on to explain, in broader terms, that she had people she trusted, connections she could rely on, and while she couldn't be there in person, that didn't limit her ability to handle things from a distance. She spoke about protecting her own, about looking out for the people who mattered to her, and there was something deeply reassuring in the way she framed it, not as a favor, not as a burden, but as something she simply did. When Olivia asked what she owed her, the question coming from a place of both gratitude and practical concern, Raven brushed it off without hesitation. Her answer, immediate and firm. "Free," she said, the word landing with a kind of quiet authority that made it clear there would be no negotiation. She mentioned favors owed, people willing to step in when she asked, and Olivia didn't press further, sensing that the details weren't meant to be unpacked right now. Instead, she thanked her, the words coming more easily now, carried by a growing sense that the weight she had been holding alone was finally being shared. When the call ended, the silence that followed felt different, less oppressive, as if something had shifted just enough to give her room to think again. Finding the address took only a moment, though the act of retrieving it felt heavier than she expected. The cigar box sat where it always had, tucked away with the small collection of cards and keepsakes she couldn't quite bring herself to throw out, each one a reminder of something that once felt simpler. The envelope was easy to recognize, the handwriting familiar, and as she pulled the card free, the address stared back at her with a clarity that made the next step unavoidable. For a brief moment, she hesitated, her thumb hovering over her phone as she considered what sending it might set into motion. The thought of regret flickered through her mind, quick but persistent, raising questions she didn't have answers to yet, but it was just as quickly pushed aside by the reality of her situation, the memory of those messages, the constant tension that had taken over her days and nights. She needed this to stop, needed the looming threat to be handled in a way she couldn't manage on her own, and Raven had made it clear that she could take care of it. With a steady breath, Olivia typed out the address and sent it, the small action carrying a weight far greater than the motion itself. Afterward, she reached out to Chanel, the connection between everything too significant to ignore, her fingers moving quickly as she explained that things with Paolo had escalated and that Raven was stepping in to help. The response came back sooner than she expected, short but enough to catch her off guard, hinting at something else unfolding in the background. Chanel mentioned that Raven was helping her with something as well, the words landing in a way that felt oddly incomplete, as if there was more beneath them that wasn't being said. Olivia stared at the screen for a moment, a new thread of unease weaving its way into her thoughts as she typed back, asking for more details, for clarity that suddenly felt important. But the conversation stopped there, Chanel's silence stretching on without explanation, leaving Olivia alone again with her questions. The room felt quieter than it had before, the absence of a reply creating a space that her mind quickly filled with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last as she waited, uncertain of what was coming next. Chapter 12. Thomas. The Monday after the flight. The Monday after the flight began like any other morning, but Thomas felt the subtle difference before he even stepped into the station, as if the rhythm of his day had been thrown slightly off beat without an obvious cause. He had been looking forward to Steph's return, not out of any grand anticipation, but because her presence restored a balance that made everything else manageable, predictable, and contained. When she was gone, the weight of the newsroom shifted onto his shoulders in a way that was both familiar and exhausting, forcing him to step into decisions that normally pass through her office first. Legal questions, ethical dilemmas, personnel conflicts, and constant operational demands blurred together into a non-stop stream that left little room for error and even less room to breathe. It wasn't that he couldn't handle it, but the accumulation of it all, layered on top of his already full life, made even the smallest disruptions feel amplified. At home, the pace never truly slowed, and his role as assistant news director bled seamlessly into his responsibilities as a father without offering him a clear boundary between the two. Mornings were a coordinated effort of movement and timing, juggling breakfast, schedules, and the endless logistics that came with raising two teenagers whose lives seemed to expand in every direction at once. Practices, rehearsals, and social plans turned his evenings into a constant shuttle service, one that required precision and patience in equal measure. Lizzie's frequent absences only added to the strain, creating a quiet undercurrent of frustration he rarely voiced but felt nonetheless, especially on days when both work and home demanded more than he had to give. Still, he managed it, because that was what he did, even if it meant carrying more than his share without complaint. That morning unfolded with its usual sequence of small departures, each one marked by a lack of ceremony that had become routine over time. He said goodbye to Ellen and Will, their exchanges brief but familiar, before loading Claire's oversized cello into the back of the minivan, with more effort than he cared to admit. The instrument seemed to take on a life of its own as he maneuvered it awkwardly, nearly losing his grip, before Claire snatched it from him with a mixture of impatience and practiced ease. She barely paused long enough to acknowledge him before disappearing into the school, her focus already elsewhere, leaving him standing there with a faint sense of having been dismissed. It was a small moment, insignificant on its own, but it lingered just long enough to remind him how quickly things were changing. Dropping Barkley off at the doggy daycare felt like another transaction in a morning full of them, the dog bounding out of the car with far more enthusiasm than he had shown at home. The place was expensive, far more than Thomas thought was necessary, but Ellen insisted it was worth it to keep the dog entertained and out of trouble. Watching Barkley disappear without so much as a backward glance, Thomas couldn't help but feel a quiet amusement at how easily he had been replaced, even in that small exchange. It was just another reminder that everything moved forward whether he paused to notice it or not. By the time he reached the McDonald's drive-thru, he was already settling into the mindset of the day ahead, the familiar comfort of routine guiding him through the motions. The newsroom greeted him with its usual gradual awakening, a low hum of activity building as people filtered in and began preparing for the day's broadcasts. Bernie at the reception desk offered a casual greeting, one that Thomas returned automatically as he made his way inside, coffee in hand and eyes already scanning for signs of anything out of place. He checked the time, noting it was 8:23, leaving just enough room to review emails and finalize details before the manager meeting. Steph's office caught his attention almost immediately. The door closed and the lights off, an absence that stood out more than it should have. She was rarely late, and when she was, she made sure people knew, so the silence felt unusual in a way that was difficult to ignore. As the minutes passed, Thomas continued working through his tasks, pairing reporters with photographers and reviewing story assignments with the efficiency of someone who had done it countless times before. Still, his attention drifted back to that closed door more often than he wanted to admit, each glance carrying a slightly sharper edge of annoyance. By 8:29, the rest of the management team had begun gathering in the conference room, their quiet conversations forming a backdrop to his growing irritation. If she was going to be late, he thought, the least she could do was send a message, a simple acknowledgement that she wasn't there yet. He checked his phone again, half expecting to find a missed notification, but there was nothing waiting for him. At 8:30, he exhaled slowly and picked up his laptop, stepping into the conference room with a forced sense of composure. The others looked at him expectantly, their expressions shifting quickly to confusion as they realized Steph wasn't behind him. Lucy was the first to speak, her tone light but curious as she asked where Lizzie was and whether she was supposed to be back that day. Thomas kept his response neutral, offering no speculation as he suggested they begin the meeting and bring her up to speed when she arrived. Running the meeting felt different this time, heavier and slightly disjointed, as if he were stepping into a role he knew well, but hadn't prepared to take on that morning. He stumbled slightly over the order of speakers, small missteps that irritated him more than they likely registered to anyone else. He checked his phone again, the absence of any response, now shifting from annoyance to something more concerning. A faint unease settled in, one he tried to dismiss with logic as he considered the possibilities. If something serious had happened, the newsroom would already know, given the constant monitoring of police scanners and emergency reports that define their environment. Accidents, incidents, anything out of the ordinary would have surfaced quickly, making it unlikely that Steph's silence was tied to something catastrophic. Still, the lack of communication didn't fit her pattern, and that inconsistency was enough to keep the thought lingering. Nora's presence beside him confirmed that he wasn't the only one noticing, her voice low as she asked if everything was all right and whether Steph had mentioned any changes to her schedule. Thomas shook his head, his response carrying a hint of uncertainty as he tried to piece together the last communication he had received. The email confirming her attendance at the election meeting came to mind, a brief acknowledgement sent late Wednesday afternoon, likely from an airport during a layover. It had seemed routine at the time, nothing out of the ordinary, but now it stood out as the last clear point of contact. The silence that followed felt longer in retrospect, stretching into something that no longer aligned with what he expected. He called her, hoping the direct approach would cut through whatever delay had kept her from responding, but the call went straight to voicemail, offering no explanation and no reassurance. His follow-up text was brief but pointed, expressing concern without sounding alarmed, though he could feel the shift in his own tone as he typed it. Meanwhile, the newsroom continued moving forward, indifferent to the uncertainty that had begun to settle around him. Reporters needed assignments, producers needed direction, and the 9 o'clock meeting loomed, demanding his full attention whether he was ready or not. He pushed the distraction aside and stepped into the role, telling the team she would be in later, a simple statement meant to keep things steady. The text finally came through just as he was considering escalating the situation, the notification pulling his attention immediately as he read it once, then again, and then a third time to be sure he understood. Steph was in Atlanta, she wrote. Something unexpected had come up, and she would be out for the entire week, possibly longer. The words felt abrupt, disconnected from the context he had been operating within, leaving him with more questions than answers. Nora's reaction mirrored his own. Disbelief as she read over his shoulder, her quiet exclamation underscoring just how unusual the situation was. Thomas ran his hands through his hair, the gesture automatic, as his mind shifted quickly to the implications of her absence. The exchange that followed offered little clarity, her responses brief and controlled, providing just enough information to acknowledge the situation without actually explaining it. When he asked to speak with her directly, hoping a conversation might fill in the gaps, her reply came as a voice memo instead, her tone distant and firm as she instructed him not to check in until the following week. The finality of it left him unsettled, the lack of engagement cutting deeper than any direct explanation might have. His frustration built quickly, tempered only by the awareness that his position required restraint, even when it felt undeserved. In the end, he responded with a simple acknowledgement. Knowing anything more would risk crossing a line he couldn't afford to approach. The rest of the day unfolded with the steady momentum of a newsroom that couldn't pause, even as his thoughts remained partially anchored to the unanswered questions. He informed the general manager, recognizing that the situation extended beyond his immediate responsibilities, and watched as concern shifted into something more serious at that level. By the afternoon, the absence had taken on a different weight, one that extended beyond inconvenience into something that felt increasingly unresolved. As he returned to the newsroom, balancing the demands of the day with the uncertainty still lingering, he realized that whatever was happening with Steph was far from over, and whatever came next would likely reshape more than just the week ahead. Chapter 13. Drew. The Monday after the flight. What the hell is going on? I muttered into the hollow stillness of my office, the words bouncing uselessly off walls that had long since stopped offering answers. My fingers moved with practiced precision as I packed my briefcase, snapping the metal tab shut with a sharp, decisive click that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet. The newsroom sat down a long, dim hallway, empty at this hour, leaving me alone with a frustration that had nowhere to go and no one to absorb it. I was the general manager, the one who was supposed to have control, yet here I was talking to myself like a man trying to convince the air that he still had it. The anger simmered beneath my skin, tight and restless, as I replayed the day in my mind. Lizzie, my news director, my right hand for 10 years, had simply vanished from responsibility, leaving behind nothing but silence and confusion. Calls unanswered, messages ignored, no explanation offered, and no sign of the professionalism I had come to depend on from her. It wasn't just the absence that unsettled me. It was the complete break in character, the betrayal of consistency that made it feel personal in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I flicked off the office light with more force than necessary, the switch snapping under my fingers as if it too had wronged me. The door slammed behind me with a satisfying finality, the kind of sound that momentarily tricks you into believing something has been resolved. My footsteps were heavy as I made my way through the parking lot, the January darkness wrapping around me like a damp, cold blanket. Each breath came out sharp in the chilled air, carrying with it the tension I couldn't seem to shake. By the time I reached my car, my jaw was tight, my thoughts running in circles that refused to settle. If she didn't call me back tomorrow, I would. I paused, realizing I didn't actually know how that sentence ended. Would I fire her? The idea felt both justified and unthinkable, a contradiction that left me standing there for a moment longer than necessary before I finally tossed my briefcase across the passenger seat. The leather thudded against the cushion as I climbed in, slamming the door with a force that matched the storm in my chest. The engine came to life with a low, smooth hum, and I cranked the radio louder than usual, letting the steady rhythm of a country song fill the car. My hand thumped against the steering wheel in time with the beat, an unconscious attempt to burn off the frustration that clung to me. Street lights streaked past as I pulled onto the road, their glow reflecting across the windshield like fleeting thoughts I couldn't quite grasp. Halfway home, the music began to grate on me, the lyrics suddenly too cheerful for the mood I was in. I reached out and muted the radio, the silence returning but feeling different now, less oppressive and more contemplative. "Call Lisa," I said, my voice steady but low, and the car responded in its calm, measured tone, acknowledging the command without judgment. Her voice came through the speakers moments later, soft and familiar, carrying a warmth that immediately eased something inside me. "Drew," she said, and even after all these years, hearing her say my name like that sent a faint, unexpected flutter through my chest. I let out a slow breath, the tension loosening just enough for me to speak. Before I could explain, she beat me to it. "What's wrong?" she asked, her intuition as sharp as ever, cutting straight through the surface to the truth underneath. I almost smiled despite myself, shaking my head slightly as I merged into another lane, the motion grounding me. "You're not going to believe this," I began, my voice carrying a mix of disbelief and irritation. "Lizzie didn't show up to work today. Not only that, she texted Thomas saying she'd be out all week, but she won't answer any of my calls." The words felt heavier as I said them out loud, as if giving them form made the situation more real than I wanted it to be. There was a pause on the other end, and I could picture Lisa processing the information, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean she didn't show up? Is she sick?" she asked, concern threading through her tone. She had always liked Lizzie, respected her, and that made this situation feel even more unsettling. "I don't think so," I replied, glancing at the passing traffic as I spoke. Apparently, she went straight from the conference in San Diego to Atlanta. That's what she told Thomas anyway. All she said was that something came up. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, frustration creeping back in. "She won't answer me, Lisa. No calls, no messages, nothing. This is not like her." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thoughtful, deliberate, the kind that meant Lisa was already searching for solutions. "Did you call Andre?" she asked finally, her voice steady but purposeful. Her son might know something. I blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the suggestion and my own failure to think of it. "No," I admitted, a hint of embarrassment slipping into my tone. I didn't even think about that. It was such an obvious step, and yet I had been so caught up in my own frustration that I had overlooked it entirely. "Well, you should," she said gently, not as a reprimand, but as a nudge in the right direction. "He might have some idea of what's going on." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, the clarity of her thinking cutting through the haze that had been clouding mine. "I'll call him when I get home," I said, feeling a slight shift in my perspective, as if the situation had just gained a new angle. We talked for a few more minutes, her voice steadying me in a way nothing else could, before I ended the call and continued the drive in a quieter, more focused state. By the time I walked into the house, the earlier anger had settled into something more measured, though no less concerning. The familiar comfort of home wrapped around me as I set my briefcase down and made my way to the den. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated the space, just enough to create a calm contrast to the tension I still carried. I sat down with my laptop, pulling up the employee records with a sense of purpose that had been missing earlier. Lizzie's file appeared quickly, and there it was. Emergency contact information neatly listed, waiting for a moment like this. Andre's name stood out immediately, and I hovered over it for a second, considering what this call might mean. He lived in Minneapolis, working with some kind of team, if I remembered correctly. A good kid from what I had seen over the years, polite and respectful in the few interactions we had shared. I had met him a handful of times at the station when he was younger, and each time he had left a positive impression, the kind that sticks with you even if you don't see the person often. My hand rested on my phone as hesitation crept in, slowing me down. What if he didn't know anything? Worse, what if calling him caused unnecessary worry? The last thing I wanted was to alarm him, without reason, to be the voice that introduced concern into his evening without offering any answers in return. I leaned back slightly, staring at the screen as I tried to figure out how I would even begin that conversation. "Hi, Andre. This is Drew, your mom's boss." The word sounded awkward even in my head, too formal and yet too intrusive at the same time. I shifted in my seat, the uncertainty making me pause longer than I intended. Maybe I would phrase it differently. Something simpler, less alarming. "Have you heard from your mom recently?" Even that felt loaded, the kind of question that carried an unspoken weight behind it. I imagined being on the receiving end of that call, the immediate concern it would spark, and it didn't sit right with me. I glanced back at the screen, scanning the rest of the contact list, and noticed 2 additional names. One was a sister, living in Indianapolis, someone I had never met and knew nothing about beyond the basic details in the system. The other name, however, stirred a faint recognition. Dennis. His address was just a couple of digits off from Lizzie's, suggesting proximity, and I closed my eyes briefly as I searched my memory. It came back to me in pieces, like a scene slowly coming into focus. A 4th of July barbecue, bright summer light, the smell of grilled food hanging in the air, and Dennis standing there with a craft beer in his hand. He had introduced himself as Lizzie's neighbor, his demeanor slightly awkward but genuine, the kind of person who meant well, even if he wasn't entirely comfortable in social settings. I remembered the way his glasses caught the sunlight, the hint of gray in his hair, and the easy smile he offered as he told me he watched Channel 3 every day. Compliments like that always landed well, simple but sincere. We had talked briefly, just enough for him to mention that he took care of Lizzie's cat when she was out of town. It was a small detail, but one that suddenly felt significant now, a possible thread to pull on in a situation that offered very few. The memory ended as abruptly as it had begun. Lisa calling me over to join another group, and Dennis fading back into the background of that summer afternoon. I opened my eyes and looked at the clock on the wall, noting that it was just before 7 in the evening. Not too late for a call, I reasoned, though there was still a slight hesitation in my chest. This wasn't a casual check-in. It was a step into something uncertain, something that felt like it might lead to answers I wasn't entirely prepared for. Still, doing nothing wasn't an option, and the weight of that realization pushed me forward. I picked up my phone, scrolling to the number listed beside Dennis's name, and held it there for a moment as I steadied myself. Then, with a quiet exhale, I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, listening as it began to ring, each tone stretching the seconds just a little longer than they should have. Chapter 14. Dennis. The Monday after the flight. The townhouse felt colder than it had any right to, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the absence next door and decided to echo it back into my space. I had already turned the thermostat up to 70, 2 full notches higher than I ever allowed myself, yet the air still carried a faint chill that clung to my skin. The electric fireplace flickered to life with artificial warmth, its glow casting soft orange light across the room, more comforting to the eyes than to the body. Still, I let it run, leaning into the illusion of heat, and pulled a pair of fingerless gloves from the mudroom drawer, sliding them on as though they might bridge the gap between comfort and reality. The kettle clicked on with a familiar hum, and I moved through the motions of making tea with deliberate care, grounding myself in something simple and predictable. Chamomile always had a way of settling me, its floral scent rising gently as the water began to heat, promising a calm I hadn't quite earned yet. I added honey and a squeeze of lemon, watching the steam curl upward in soft spirals, the warmth of the mug slowly seeping into my hands. For a moment, I stood there in the quiet, letting the heat press against my palms, wishing it could reach deeper than that. My thoughts drifted next door to Steph's side of the townhouse, where the cold would be even more pronounced. She had turned her thermostat down before leaving, just like she always did, practical and consistent in ways that now felt almost cruel. The image of her empty rooms lingered in my mind, the stillness, the untouched furniture, the absence of movement or sound. And then there was Lenny, left behind in that quiet, waiting without understanding why the rhythms of his life had suddenly shifted. I had already checked on him 3 times that day, each visit driven by a mixture of responsibility and something harder to define. Each time I walked in, he had greeted me, but not with the usual energy or expectation. His movements slower, more deliberate. When I set his food down, he ate, but there was a hesitation in him, a subtle pause that made me wonder if he was listening for someone else. It felt ridiculous to think a cat could miss someone in such a visible way, yet there was something in his quiet, plaintive meow that suggested otherwise. Sitting down on the couch, I wrapped myself in a thick Mexican blanket I had picked up years ago in the streets of Tijuana, its fabric heavy and familiar against my shoulders. The colors had faded slightly over time, but the texture remained comforting, a small piece of warmth that felt earned rather than manufactured. I leaned back, the weight of the day settling into my bones, and reached for the remote, ready to let the television fill the silence with something meaningless. The idea of flipping through channels without thinking felt like a relief I desperately needed. The phone rang just as I was about to turn the TV on, the sound cutting through the quiet with a sharp insistence that immediately pulled me back into the world. I glanced at the screen, expecting to see Steph's name, but instead an unfamiliar number blinked back at me. The area code registered a second later, Madison, and something about that detail made me hesitate before answering. I lifted the phone slowly, pressing it to my ear as a faint unease settled in my chest. "Hello," I said, my voice steady but cautious, already bracing for something I couldn't quite name. The voice on the other end responded quickly, asking if this was Dennis and if I was Lizzie Monroe's neighbor, and I felt myself straighten without realizing it. The blanket slipped off one leg as I shifted, the sudden alertness pushing away the earlier comfort I had tried to create. "Yes," I replied, my tone sharpening slightly. "Who is this?" The man introduced himself as Drew Jensen, the general manager from Channel 3, and the name clicked into place with a distant familiarity. I remembered the barbecue, the brief exchange, the way conversations had overlapped in the warm summer air. He apologized for calling in the evening, mentioning that we had met before, and I could hear something in his voice that wasn't just politeness. There was tension there, restrained, but unmistakable, like someone trying to keep control of a situation that was beginning to slip. "Is everything okay?" I asked, sitting up fully now, the earlier calm replaced by a quiet alertness that settled into my spine. There was a pause on the line, not long enough to be dramatic, but long enough to signal that the answer wasn't simple. When he spoke again, his words came carefully, as though he were choosing each one with intention. "Well, actually, this is a little awkward," he admitted, his voice lowering slightly. He explained that Lizzie hadn't shown up to work that day and had sent messages that seemed out of character, offering little explanation and avoiding direct communication. As he spoke, I reached for the remote and turned the television off before it had even been turned on, the silence now feeling necessary rather than oppressive. She told Thomas, our assistant news director, that something had come up and she needed to go to Atlanta for at least a week, he continued, the frustration creeping through despite his effort to remain composed. He mentioned that she hadn't given them any warning, hadn't responded to calls, and hadn't followed any of the patterns. That defined her professionalism. "Do you know anything more?" he asked finally, the question landing with a weight that settled heavily in my chest. My mind moved quickly, pulling together fragments of what I knew and what I suspected, weaving them into something that felt dangerously close to speculation. I thought of Trent, of the pristine white condo, of the carefully maintained trees that line the outside like a curated image. I saw them together in my mind, sharing coffee, walking through Atlanta's streets, their shoulders brushing, their conversations carrying the kind of energy that comes with something new. The images shifted, becoming more intimate, more imagined than real, and I felt a sudden hesitation tighten my grip on the phone. Should I tell him any of that? The question lingered, heavy and complicated, as I considered the boundaries Lizzie had clearly drawn. She hadn't shared those details with her workplace, and that omission felt intentional, a line she had chosen not to cross. Yet the concern in Drew's voice was real, grounded in responsibility, and a need for clarity, and I found myself caught between loyalty and transparency. For a moment, all I could do was breathe, the silence stretching just enough for him to notice. "Drew," I began slowly, my voice carrying the weight of my hesitation. "I do know a little, but not much." The words felt clumsy as they left my mouth, like trying to open a car door with a pinky, possible but awkward and slightly uncomfortable in a way that made you second-guess the effort. "Go on," he said, his tone steady but expectant, and I took another breath, forcing myself to keep it simple. I believe she met someone in San Diego, I said, the sentence hanging in the air between us. That's all she shared with me. I don't know anything else. No name, no details. As soon as I finished, I felt a flicker of regret, wondering if I had said too much or not enough. There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a low whistle that carried more meaning than words. She met a man in San Diego, he repeated, the statement sounding heavier when he said it. I found myself adding, almost instinctively, she's been divorced for 3 years, as though that context might soften the implications or make the situation feel more reasonable. I'm aware of that, he replied, though his voice carried a hint of irritation now, the professional composure beginning to crack. But this is unexpected. I can't believe she would neglect her work responsibilities like this. The frustration was clearer now, no longer masked, and I could imagine him pacing somewhere, trying to make sense of something that refused to fit into his expectations. I'm sorry, I said, feeling suddenly inadequate in the role I had been placed in. I don't know what to tell you. I'm just the cat sitter. The words felt small compared to the weight of his concern, but they were honest, and honesty was all I had to offer. That seemed to shift something in him, pulling him back into a more controlled, professional space. Yes, of course, he said, his tone smoothing out as he regained his footing. You've been very helpful, and I appreciate it. There was a pause, and then he asked, Does her son know about any of this? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I realized I had no answer. I hadn't considered that angle, hadn't thought about how this situation might extend beyond the immediate circle of work and neighbors. It didn't feel like something I needed to tell him. Not now, not like this. And the thought of being the one to introduce that kind of information made something in me resist. I hesitated, the silence stretching just enough to hold the weight of everything unsaid, and realized that sometimes not knowing was the only honest answer you could give. Chapter 15. Lucy. The Monday after the flight. As the digital manager of the station, my world existed somewhere between the pulse of the newsroom and the endless scroll of the internet, a space where attention moved fast and stories had to move faster. My job was to find moments, small, strange, delightful, or unexpected, and shape them into something people wanted to share, something that could travel from Madison to anywhere with a signal. I worked across everything we had, from the website to TikTok, from Twitter X to Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, constantly watching, adjusting, refining. It was a rhythm I had come to love, the quiet satisfaction of turning something simple into something that felt bigger than it actually was. There was a particular kind of joy in taking a light, almost throwaway idea and elevating it into something that resonated. A new exhibit at the zoo, for example, might seem like nothing more than a quick local update, but with the right angle, the right music, the right pacing, it could become something people paused for. I remembered one clip in particular, the way I framed it, the edits timed just right, the subtle humor layered in without trying too hard. When it started gaining traction, the shares climbing steadily, I felt that familiar spark of accomplishment. And when the zoo itself reposted it, that spark turned into something warmer, something that lingered with me long after the moment passed. I carried that quiet pride with me through the rest of the day, a subtle glow that softened the edges of everything else. It wasn't about recognition in a grand sense, but about knowing I had taken something small and given it reach, made it matter in a way it hadn't before. That was the part of the job that kept me engaged, the constant search for moments that could connect people, even briefly. It made the long hours in front of screens feel purposeful, even when the rest of the world blurred into a series of notifications and deadlines. Because I lived in that digital space all day, I often found myself acting as a bridge between it and the newsroom. If I came across something interesting, something that might spark an idea or offer a fresh angle, I would share it with whoever was nearby. It became second nature, a kind of quiet collaboration that didn't require formal meetings or structured conversations. Over time, people began to rely on me for more than just content, turning to me when their phones froze or their computers refused to cooperate. I didn't mind being the unofficial tech support, even though it wasn't technically part of my job description. There was something satisfying about solving problems, about being the person who could fix things when they went wrong. It also gave me a different kind of connection to the people around me, one that wasn't tied to deadlines or performance, but to simple, everyday frustrations. Corporate IT existed, of course, but they felt distant, slower, less accessible, and people preferred the immediacy of walking over to my desk. Steph had always been one of the people who made that environment feel manageable, even on the busiest days. She carried herself with a calm that seemed almost effortless, a steadiness that made everything around her feel less chaotic. Whenever I had questions or needed guidance, she was someone I could turn to without hesitation, knowing she would listen without judgment. It wasn't just her experience that made her a mentor to me, but the way she approached people, the quiet respect she gave without making it feel like a favor. She was also quite simply kind, and that mattered more than people often acknowledged. She remembered small things, brought in little gifts during the holidays, and made a point to recognize good work without being prompted. I had never heard her raise her voice, never seen her lose control in a way that made others uncomfortable. That consistency created a sense of trust, a feeling that you could rely on her not just professionally, but personally as well. Despite the 15-year age gap between us, we found easy common ground in small, almost trivial ways that somehow made a difference. We were both left-handed, something that came up more often than expected in a world designed for right-handed people. We both depended on coffee to get through the day, sharing quiet moments in the break room that felt more like pauses than interruptions. And then there was our shared appreciation for certain celebrities, a running thread of humor that wove its way into our conversations. It started during an editorial meeting, one of those long sessions where ideas were tossed around with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Someone suggested a story about famous people from Wisconsin, and Mark Ruffalo's name came up, prompting a shift in the room's energy. There was something about realizing that someone so recognizable had roots not far from where we were, a sense of connection that felt oddly personal. "He's hot even though he's kind of old," I had said, half joking, half serious, and Steph had laughed in a way that made the moment feel shared rather than judged. "I agree he's good-looking," she replied, her tone light, "and he's closer to my age," which only made me laugh harder. That exchange became a kind of shorthand between us, a joke we returned to whenever we needed a break from the more serious aspects of the job. If I mentioned going on a date, She would raise an eyebrow and ask if his initials happened to be Mr., drawing out the joke in a way that felt familiar and easy. When she talked about traveling, I would tell her to pass along our greetings to Mark R., as though he were a mutual acquaintance rather than a distant celebrity. It was harmless, silly, and somehow grounding, a reminder that not everything had to be taken so seriously. So when she didn't show up to work, the absence felt immediate and noticeable, like a missing note in a piece of music you knew well. Nora, our Dayside executive producer, pulled me aside while I was grabbing an afternoon coffee, her expression more serious than usual. She told me about the text Steph had sent to Thomas, the assistant news director, explaining that she would be out for the week, and something about the situation didn't sit right with either of us. The details were sparse, the tone of the message slightly off, and the lack of direct communication raised more questions than it answered. As Nora spoke, I felt a subtle shift in my own perception, the situation moving from mildly unusual to quietly concerning. Steph wasn't someone who disappeared without explanation, and the disconnect between her usual behavior and this sudden absence created a tension I couldn't ignore. Almost instinctively, I decided to reach out to her in the only way that felt natural, given our dynamic. Humor had always been our shared language, a way of cutting through stress and reconnecting when things felt off. When I returned to my desk, I picked up my phone and typed out a message, letting that familiar tone guide me. "I hear you're out this week," I wrote, adding, "Should I reschedule that? Meeting with Mark R? He'll be very disappointed, but I'm sure he'll get over it." I hit send and waited, expecting a quick, light-hearted response, something that would reassure me that everything was fine. Minutes passed, then an hour, and I found myself checking my phone more often than I wanted to admit. I tried to focus on my work, pulling together web stories and monitoring engagement metrics, but my attention kept drifting back to that unanswered message. When my phone finally pinged, the sound felt louder than usual, cutting through my concentration with a sharp clarity. I picked it up immediately, expecting the familiar tone I knew so well, but what I saw made me pause. "Yes, please reschedule with Mark R," the message read, and I felt my brows knit together as I read it again. It was the words themselves that caught me off guard, not what they said, but how they said it. There was no humor, no hint of the playful back and forth that defined our exchanges, just a straightforward, almost formal response. It didn't feel like her, and that subtle difference settled into my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite remove. I tried again, leaning further into the joke, hoping to draw her back into that familiar rhythm. "Mark R. says, to call him as soon as you can," I texted, adding, "He misses you," and waited, expecting some kind of reaction. When nothing came, I followed up with another message, pushing just a little more. "Are you dissing Mark R? You know he'll turn into the Hulk." The reference felt obvious, something that should have at least earned a response, even if it was just a short acknowledgement. But the silence stretched on, heavy and unresponsive, and I found myself staring at my phone longer than I should have. It wasn't just the lack of reply that bothered me, but the feeling that I was reaching into a space that no longer responded the way it used to. By the time I got home that evening, the unease had settled deeper, though I tried to push it aside. I rolled out my yoga mat in the living room, letting a YouTube video guide me through familiar movements, focusing on breath and balance. The room was quiet except for the instructor's calm voice, and for a while I managed to lose myself in the rhythm of it. Then my phone pinged again, the sound cutting through the calm like a crack in glass. I paused the video, shifting out of a cross-legged twist, and reached for the phone, a small sense of anticipation rising despite everything. When I saw her name, I felt a flicker of relief, quickly replaced by something else as I read the message. "I'm very busy this week. I asked you to reschedule the meeting. I should be back next week." The words were clear, direct, and completely devoid of the warmth I had come to expect. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my mouth slightly open, the shock settling into my expression in a way that would have been obvious to anyone watching. I didn't know how to respond, or if I even should, and that uncertainty held me in place longer than I expected. Eventually, I set the phone down without replying, the silence feeling heavier now than it had before. When I pressed play on the yoga video again and moved into downward dog, something began to gnaw at me, a quiet but persistent sense that something wasn't right. The feeling stayed with me as I finished the session, lingering beneath the surface of everything else. It wasn't just that Steph was gone, or that her messages felt different, but that the shift seemed deliberate in a way I couldn't explain. As I rolled up my mat and stood there in the dim light of the room, I made a quiet decision to pull Thomas aside the next day and ask him what he thought, hoping that maybe, together, we could make sense of something that refused to. Settle into place. Chapter 16. Thomas, the Tuesday after the flight. There had been no further word from Lizzie since the brief, puzzling messages she had sent the day before, the one stating she would be out for the week without offering anything resembling an explanation. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have, settling into the corners of the newsroom like something unseen but present. I found myself accepting the reality of it, stepping into the role she had temporarily vacated, though the circumstances surrounding her absence refused to. Sit comfortably, in my mind. Part of me leaned into the opportunity, recognizing it as a chance to test myself, in a position I had quietly considered for years, while another part remained aware of the responsibility now resting squarely on my shoulders. Running the newsroom carried a weight that wasn't always visible from the outside, a constant awareness that every decision carried consequences that extended beyond the moment. I was now the final gatekeeper for anything that made it to air, the last line between raw information and what the public would ultimately see and hear. There was no one above me to second guess, no one to absorb the impact if something went wrong, and that awareness sat quietly beneath everything I did. General managers rarely stepped into this space, their backgrounds rooted more in sales than in editorial judgment, leaving the day-to-day decisions firmly in my hands. The manager meeting began like it always did, a familiar rhythm that moved from one department to the next, as each person shared updates, concerns, and ideas. We covered staffing for the day, story pitches that needed refining, digital trends that might influence coverage, and the ongoing projects that required attention. The conversation flowed steadily, each voice adding another layer to the collective understanding of what lay ahead. This time, however, I felt more grounded, more prepared to guide the discussion rather than simply participate in it. Yesterday had been different, marked by uncertainty and a lingering sense of imbalance. But today I felt something closer to clarity. I reminded myself quietly that I was capable, that I had been preparing for moments like this long before they arrived. The words came silently, a steady reassurance that I repeated to myself as the meeting progressed. "You've got this," I thought, letting the phrase settle into me as I spoke with a confidence that felt increasingly natural. My McDonald's coffee sat beside me, its familiar warmth and scent offering a small but meaningful comfort amid the steady flow of conversation. It was a simple thing, a daily ritual that anchored me in the middle of everything else. The taste, slightly bitter but reliable, felt like an old friend that never asked questions or demanded more than I could give. I took a sip between updates, letting the warmth settle into my chest as I listened and responded in turn. When the meeting wrapped, there was a brief window before the larger newsroom gathering, a stretch of about 10 minutes that felt both fleeting and necessary. Most of the others filtered out of the conference room quickly, their movements purposeful as they transitioned into the next part of the day. I stayed behind, opening my laptop and scrolling through the steady stream of emails that never seemed to slow down. Each message carried its own urgency, its own demand for attention, and I worked through them methodically, prioritizing what needed immediate action. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Lucy lingering longer than usual, her movements slower, more deliberate than the others who had already left. She gathered her things, but there was a hesitation in the way she did it, as though she were waiting for something. When the last person stepped out and the door closed, she turned back toward me and gently pushed it shut, sealing us inside the quiet of the room. The expression on her face shifted the atmosphere immediately, replacing the routine calm with something more uncertain. "Thomas, can I talk to you about something?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying an edge that suggested this wasn't a casual question. I nodded, my attention sharpening as I leaned back slightly, already sensing that whatever she had to say would circle back to the absence that had been hovering over everything. The thought crossed my mind that she had been in contact with Steph, that she might have information I didn't, and with that came a flicker of concern about how much should be shared and with whom. I felt a brief tightening in my chest as I considered the implications, aware that I had been asked to keep things contained, to avoid unnecessary speculation. The idea of saying the wrong thing, of allowing information to spread beyond its intended boundaries, unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Not now, I thought. Not when everything felt like it might be quietly building toward something larger, something that could shift the direction of my own path. "It's about Steph," Lucy began, stepping closer to the table and lowering herself into a chair. Her legs started bouncing almost immediately, a small, restless motion that betrayed her effort to remain composed. I nodded again, keeping my expression neutral, though I couldn't ignore the familiarity she shared with Steph, the ease with which they often connected over things I had never quite been part of. I'd seen them laughing together more than once, their conversations flowing in a way that felt natural to them but slightly out of reach for me. There was a dynamic there that I respected but didn't fully understand, something that existed outside my perspective. Now that connection seemed to carry weight, suggesting that Lucy might have insights I lacked. "You know about the running joke I have with Steph about Mark Ruffalo, right?" she asked, her eyes searching my face for recognition. I didn't, not really, but I nodded anyway, understanding that the specifics mattered less than where she was going with it. She continued without hesitation, explaining how she had reached out to Steph the day before, using that shared humor as a way to break through the strangeness of the situation. "I texted her like we always do," Lucy said, her words coming a little faster now. "I joked about her having a meeting with him, asked if I should reschedule it, just normal stuff." I listened closely, noting the shift in her tone as she moved from explanation to concern. And she texted me back like he was real, like it wasn't a joke at all. I frowned slightly, trying to follow the thread she was laying out, though the significance wasn't immediately clear. "She told me to reschedule the meeting," Lucy continued, her voice tightening, "and then she just kind of brushed me off." She paused, searching for the right words, her expression growing more unsettled. "I don't know, Thomas. It felt off, like something wasn't right." "Off how?" I asked, leaning forward slightly, though I wasn't entirely sure what I expected her to say. She hesitated for a moment, then met my gaze with a seriousness that made me sit up straighter. "Like someone else has her phone," she said quietly, the words landing with a weight that lingered in the space between us. I tilted my head, considering the idea, though it felt like a stretch, something that didn't quite align with what we knew. "Can I see the texts?" I asked, extending my hand. She passed me her phone without hesitation, and I read through the messages carefully. Then again, looking for something that might confirm or dismiss her concern. When I handed the phone back, I kept my tone steady, choosing reassurance over speculation. "I'm sure it's nothing," I said, though I could hear the faint uncertainty beneath my own words. Maybe she's just playing along in a different way, or maybe she didn't catch the joke. I paused, then added, "How would anyone even have her phone? And if they did, why would they be texting us about meetings?" Lucy leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she listened, clearly unconvinced. "I don't know," she said, her voice quieter but no less firm. "But it doesn't feel right." She lowered her voice further, almost to a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "I have a gut feeling, Thomas. My Reiki coach always says those feelings matter." I let out a slow breath, choosing my words carefully as I responded. "If something bad had happened," I said, keeping my tone calm, "why would anyone keep her phone? It could be tracked. It wouldn't make sense." Even as I spoke, I was aware that logic didn't always account for everything, that there were gaps it couldn't fill. The sound of movement outside the conference room interrupted us, voices gathering, footsteps approaching as the newsroom meeting began to take shape. We both glanced toward the door, the moment shifting as the outside world pressed back in. Lucy turned her attention back to me, her expression set with a determination that hadn't been there before. "I want to look into this more," she said, her voice steady, despite the tension underneath. "I'm going to try something, see how she responds, see if it's really her." I hesitated, caught between encouraging her and pulling her back, unsure of where the line should be drawn. The door began to open, people filtering in, their presence filling the room with noise and movement. I didn't have time to think it through, to weigh the potential consequences of whatever she was planning. "Okay," I said quietly, almost under my breath, meeting her eyes briefly. "Just keep me posted." "I will," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet resolve as she straightened in her chair. The room filled around us, conversations overlapping, the meeting beginning as though nothing had changed. Yet beneath it all, something had already begun to shift. Something. Neither of us could fully see yet, but both felt in different ways. Chapter 17. Olivia, the Tuesday after the flight. Paolo hadn't been at the bar the night before, and his absence had hung over the place like a storm cloud nobody wanted to stand directly beneath. The rumors had started early, passing from mouth to mouth in fragments that grew more vivid with every retelling, until by the middle of the evening they had taken on the jagged shape of a full story. Somebody said there had been a robbery at his trailer. Somebody else said he had been beaten so badly he ended up in the hospital with a broken arm, and by the time the third version reached, me, one of the waitresses, leaned close and whispered that he'd had teeth knocked out too, as if the damage needed to be catalogued carefully to feel real. There was more to it, according to the women trading details between refilling ice bins and clearing glasses. The men who went after him, they said, hadn't just come to steal. They had threatened him about something, though no one seemed to know exactly what, and that uncertainty gave the gossip a darker edge than the usual bar chatter. I kept my face blank and my hands moving, wiping down tables, stacking receipts, doing everything I could to blend into the ordinary rhythm of work, while my heart beat with a private, nearly dangerous sense of relief. I didn't ask questions, and I didn't add anything to the speculation, because the safest thing I could be in a place like that was forgettable. Even so, relief moved through me in warm, quiet waves, the kind that almost made me dizzy if I stopped to notice it too closely. If Paolo was laid up in a hospital bed, with his arm wrapped in plaster and his mouth swollen shut, then for a little while he would be out of my orbit. For a little while I could sleep without listening for footsteps in my mind, and without rehearsing explanations I hoped never to give. That feeling stayed with me into the next day, though it came tangled, with caution, because life had taught me that peace was usually borrowed and rarely permanent. The apartment was dim with late afternoon light, the kind that slipped through the blinds in pale gold bands and striped the kitchen floor. I stood at the counter an hour before work, unloading the dishwasher one plate at a time, letting the domestic simplicity of it soothe me. The dishes were still warm from the cycle, their surfaces slick with little beads of moisture, and every clink of ceramic against the counter sounded unusually loud in the quiet room. I'd almost settled into that small routine completely when my phone pinged from where it lay on the counter beside the sink. The sound made me glance over automatically, and the moment I saw Chanel's name on the screen, something inside me tightened. My hands were damp from the steam trapped inside the dishwasher, so I wiped them on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle before I reached for the phone. Even that tiny pause felt heavy, as though whatever waited on the screen had enough weight to alter the air in the room. I opened the message and read it once, then immediately read it again, slower the second time. This guy, Trent, is super sexy, but he has a temper. Don't worry, I can handle myself. Don't tell Paolo. I stood perfectly still, the towel bunched in one hand, the warmth from the dishwasher fading against my skin, while the words settled into me in a way that made the whole kitchen feel suddenly smaller. There was so much packed into those few sentences that my mind didn't know which part to grab first. Trent was a name I knew, or at least knew enough about to understand he was not the kind of man who drifted casually through people's lives. Super sexy was exactly the sort of phrase Chanel would use when she wanted to make something sound lighter than it was, dressing danger up in lipstick and a laugh, as if that changed its nature. And then there was the line that landed with the most force, "Don't tell Paolo," which was less a request than a warning, a signal. Flair sent from somewhere already too close to trouble. I typed back too fast, my thumbs moving before I had time to smooth out the panic underneath. Things have been crazy here. Paolo is in the hospital. I stared at the words after I sent them, wondering whether I should have said less, whether honesty was just another form of carelessness, when too many people were already moving inside the same mess. But the message was gone, delivered and beyond taking back, and all I could do was wait for the 3 little dots that might or might not appear. When they didn't come right away, I set the phone down and turned, back to the dishwasher, though my body had lost whatever calm it had a minute earlier. I picked up a glass, dried it, set it in the cabinet, then stood there with the cabinet door open and no memory of whether I had already put the others away. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere in the parking lot, and I flinched hard enough to feel irritated at myself. Relief had made me soft for all of 12 hours, and already the world was reminding me not to get comfortable. The phone pinged again, sharp and bright against the hush of the apartment. I snatched it up before I even realized I had moved, my pulse suddenly too quick. Chanel had written back immediately after all, and now her reply sat on the screen, with an ease that irritated me because it suggested she was calmer than I was. "Paolo's in the hospital. I promise I will send your money soon. Thanks for everything." Yeah, robbery at the trailer, if you know what I mean. He got beat up pretty badly. I read that message 3 times, each pass deepening the cold knot twisting through my stomach. If you know what I mean. The sentence carried more than one meaning, and that was exactly why it frightened me. It hinted at a truth beneath the rumor, at something arranged, or at least anticipated, and I hated how quickly my mind supplied the image of Chanel saying it, with that half-smile of hers, as if the whole world were a game she planned to win by, refusing to look nervous. I typed again, more carefully this time, forcing my hands to slow down so my fear wouldn't become visible in every word. "You're good, though. You don't need anything else?" It was a simple question on the surface, but underneath it was everything I didn't know how to ask directly. "Are you safe? Are you in over your head? Did you have something to do with this? Are you telling me just enough to keep me quiet while leaving me blind to the rest?" Her answer came back almost immediately, brief enough to be maddening. "I'm good." That was it. 2 words with the kind of confidence that either comes from real certainty or from someone who has decided there is no benefit in sounding afraid. I stared at the screen until it dimmed and reflected my own face back at me, my expression pinched, my mouth tight, my eyes carrying more worry than I wanted to admit even to myself. I set the phone down on the counter and pressed both palms flat against the cool laminate, bowing my head for a moment as the kitchen lights hummed faintly overhead. The apartment smelled like detergent, warm glass, and the lemon soap I used on the counters, all the ordinary scents of a life I kept trying to hold together with clean dishes and punctual shifts and careful silences. Yet beneath that familiar layer was another feeling entirely, one metallic and sharp, like the air before lightning, Chanel was telling me she had things handled, but nothing about the message made me believe the situation was settled. It sounded more like someone trying to keep a lid on a boiling pot. I thought about Paolo in a hospital room somewhere, his arm immobilized, his face bruised, perhaps swollen beyond recognition, and to my own shame, the first feeling that rose in me was gratitude. Not pity, not horror, not even curiosity at the full truth of what had happened to him, but pure, selfish gratitude that he was elsewhere and hurting too badly to come looking for anyone that night. The feeling sat ugly in me, but I didn't fight it. Survival had stripped away too many softer instincts for me to pretend otherwise, and fear had taught me to welcome distance from men like him however it arrived. At the same time, relief was never clean when it came wrapped around violence. Someone had gone to his trailer and left him broken enough for the whole town to gossip about it before sundown. That meant other people were making moves, settling scores, sending messages, and once that kind of thing started, it rarely ended with one visit and one ambulance ride. The problem with watching danger land on someone else was knowing it didn't always stay where. It first struck. I looked at the clock on the microwave and felt work pressing closer, another shift I would have to get through with my makeup done, my voice pleasant, and my nerves tucked so deep no one could spot them. The bar would be loud again, full of the usual neon glow, the smell of stale beer sunk into wood, the jukebox coughing out old songs while people laughed too hard and leaned too close. Someone would bring up Paolo before the first hour was over, lowering their voice for drama, even while clearly enjoying the story. I would nod in the right places, say as little as possible, and keep my face arranged into that expression women learn early, the one that reveals nothing and invites even less. But standing there in the kitchen with the cabinets half open and the dish towel still damp in my hand, I let myself feel the truth before I locked it back down. I was relieved, yes, more relieved than I had been in weeks, maybe months. I was also frightened in a new way, because Chanel had wandered into something hot and unstable with a man named Trent. And the fact that she could text about it so casually made me trust her judgment less, not more. The world around us had started moving faster than either of us could safely afford. I picked up the last plate from the dishwasher and slid it into the cabinet with careful hands, as though neatness might restore some order beyond the kitchen. Then I reached for my phone one more time and checked the thread again, reading her words until I knew them by heart and still found no comfort in them. "I'm good," she had said, and I wanted that to be true badly enough to almost believe it. But the room felt too cold now, though the dishwasher had left behind its warmth, and somewhere beneath my ribs a steady warning had begun to pulse, telling me this was not over. Not even close. Chapter 18. Lucy. The Tuesday after the flight. It was one of those days when the newsroom buzzed with a constant restless energy, the kind that usually pulled me in and kept me anchored to every flicker of movement across the monitors. Stories were breaking. Scripts were being rewritten in real time. Producers called out adjustments across the room, and the steady hum of urgency filled the space from wall to wall. Under normal circumstances, I would have been right in the center of it, tracking digital trends, coordinating updates, and shaping content with the same focus that had become second nature. But that day, my attention refused to stay where it belonged, drifting instead toward the quiet thread of messages that had begun to feel more unsettling with every passing hour. After Thomas had given me the go, ahead, even if it had come with hesitation wrapped in professionalism, I found myself replaying possibilities in my head, like a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. I kept turning over different approaches, different phrasings, wondering what kind of message might reveal something without directly asking for it. The idea wasn't just to get a response, but to see how that response came back, whether it carried the tone and familiarity I expected or something else entirely. If it was really Steph on the other end, maybe this would all dissolve into something awkward but harmless, something we could laugh about later once everything settled. But if it wasn't, then every word mattered in a way that made my pulse quicken just thinking about it. By the time lunch rolled around, the tension had followed me into the break room, settling into my shoulders and refusing to loosen its grip. Nora was there, pouring herself another cup of coffee, her posture relaxed in a way that contrasted sharply with how I felt. I hesitated for only a second before stepping closer, knowing I couldn't carry this alone anymore, not without risking a mistake I wouldn't be able to take back. I needed someone else to see what I was seeing, to confirm that I wasn't imagining things that weren't there. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice as I spoke, the words coming out faster than I intended. "I need your help," I said, glancing briefly toward the doorway to make sure we weren't being overheard. Something's off with Steph, and I don't think it's just her being distant. Nora's expression changed immediately, the casual ease replaced by focused attention, and I quickly filled her in on everything: the texts, the tone, the strange responses that didn't quite match the person we both knew. She listened without interrupting, her brow tightening as she processed the details, and when I had finished, she didn't dismiss it or try to soften it. Instead, she leaned a little closer, her voice dropping to match mine. "If you're trying to figure out if it's really her," she said, "you need to send something that forces a specific kind of response." I nodded, already understanding what she meant, but not yet sure how to execute it. "What if you made up some names?" she suggested, her eyes narrowing slightly as the idea took shape. "Tell her that Susan and Frank called and need to speak with her, and you have to know what to tell them." She paused just long enough for me to see where she was going with it. If it's really her, she'll either correct you or respond in a way that shows she knows who you're talking about. The simplicity of it struck me immediately, cutting through the noise in my head like something obvious I should have thought of myself. "That's a good idea," I said, already reaching for my phone. The words came together quickly, almost too quickly, as if they had been waiting just beneath the surface. I typed out the message exactly as Nora had suggested, reading it once, then again, before hitting send. The moment it went through, a strange stillness settled over me, the kind that comes when you realize you've crossed a line you can't uncross. We exchanged a brief look, neither of us saying anything else, because there was nothing left to say until a response came back. Nora gave a small nod, as if to reassure me, then stepped away, leaving me alone with the quiet weight of what I had just set in motion. Time stretched in a way that felt unnatural, each minute dragging slightly longer than the last as I tried to return to my work. I forced myself to focus on the tasks in front of me, updating stories, checking metrics, responding to emails, but my attention kept slipping back to my phone. Every vibration from someone else's device, every notification sound from across the room made my head lift slightly before I caught myself and looked away. More than an hour passed without anything, and the absence of a reply began to feel just as telling as any response might have been. I told myself that it didn't mean anything, that she could be busy, that she might not have seen the message yet, but the rational explanations felt thin against the growing unease. I stood up eventually, needing to move, needing to break the cycle of waiting, and started across the newsroom toward the assignment desk. The room felt louder now, the conversation sharper, the movement more pronounced, as if everything around me had gained an extra layer of intensity. I was halfway across the floor when my phone buzzed in my hand, the sudden vibration sending a jolt through me that I couldn't hide. I stopped without thinking, my breath catching slightly as I looked down at the screen. The reply was short, almost abrupt in its simplicity. "Tell them I'm out of town." That was it. No elaboration, no question, no acknowledgement of the names I had introduced. Just a flat instruction that felt stripped of any personal connection. For a moment, I couldn't move, the words sinking into me with a weight that made the rest of the room feel distant. It was as if something inside me dropped suddenly, like an elevator losing tension, leaving behind a hollow, disorienting sensation. I felt the blood drain from my face, the edges of my vision softening in a way that made me reach instinctively for the back of a nearby chair. My fingers curled around it tightly, grounding myself in something solid as the realization settled in. This wasn't right. It wasn't just off, or unusual, or slightly out of character. It was wrong in a way that bypassed logic and landed directly in something more instinctive, something that told me this wasn't Steph responding at all. The lack of recognition, the absence of any correction, the mechanical tone, it all pointed in a direction I didn't want to fully consider. "Did you get something?" Nora's voice came from beside me, low and urgent, and I turned slightly, my movement slower than usual. I held out the phone without speaking, my hand trembling just enough for me to notice it. She took it and read the message quickly, her eyes widening as the same realization seemed to hit her all at once. Her reaction was immediate, decisive in a way that cut through the uncertainty. She grabbed my arm, her grip firm but not rough, and leaned in closer. "Come with me," she said, her voice steady despite the tension underneath. "We're getting Thomas, and we're going to Drew's office." There was no room to argue, no space to hesitate, and I followed her as she moved quickly across the newsroom. The noise around us faded slightly as we focused on the path ahead, weaving through desks and chairs until we reached Thomas. Nora didn't waste time explaining in detail, just motioned for him to come with us, her urgency enough to make him follow without question. We led him into the back conference room, closing the door behind us as the noise of the newsroom was cut off abruptly. The silence inside felt heavier, more concentrated, as if it were holding its breath along with us. I handed him the phone, and Nora filled in the gaps, explaining what we had done and why, her words moving quickly but clearly. Thomas's expression changed as he read the message, the color draining slightly from his face in a way that mirrored how I had felt moments earlier. He looked up at us, his eyes moving between us as if searching for something to anchor the situation. "Listen," he said, his voice lower now, carrying a seriousness that hadn't been there before. "There's another problem." The pause that followed stretched just long enough to make the words land harder. Drew asked me not to say anything about this, he continued, his tone tightening slightly. At least, not yet. If he thinks the whole newsroom is talking about it, he's going to lose it. The concern in his voice wasn't just about the situation itself, but about the potential fallout, the ripple effect that could spread quickly in a place like this. The whole newsroom isn't talking about it, I said quickly, the words coming out sharper than I intended. It's just us. I haven't said anything to anyone else. I could hear the urgency in my own voice, the need to make that clear before anything else was assumed. Nora stepped in immediately, her tone steady and firm. If anyone's going to take the hit for this, it'll be me, she said, her gaze fixed on Thomas. But he's going to want to know about this. We're not stirring anything up. We're trying to figure out what's going on. Her words carried a quiet resolve, the kind that comes from knowing you're stepping into something complicated, but necessary. For a moment, none of us spoke, the weight of the situation settling fully into the room. Outside, the newsroom continued as if nothing had changed, voices rising and falling, keyboards clicking, phones ringing. But inside that conference room, everything felt different, as though we had crossed into a space where the rules were no longer as clear, and whatever came next would require more than just careful wording and professional distance. Chapter 19. Drew. The Tuesday after the flight. Drew called Steph again that morning, more out of stubborn hope than expectation, standing by his desk with his phone pressed to his ear as it rang out into silence. The newsroom hummed faintly behind. Him, a distant backdrop to the hollow sound of unanswered calls, and when it finally rolled to voicemail, he exhaled slowly through his nose. He didn't leave a message this time, because there was nothing left to say that he hadn't already said, and something about repeating himself felt like admitting defeat. As he lowered the phone, his mind wandered to the image he couldn't shake. Steph, somewhere in Atlanta, wrapped up in something, or someone, that mattered more to her than the responsibilities she had walked away from. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers brushing against the edge of his desk as he stared at nothing in particular, weighing his next move. Calling HR crossed his mind, a logical escalation, but even that felt premature without something concrete to justify it. The situation lingered in an uncomfortable space between personal concern and professional obligation, and he was still deciding which side it would ultimately fall on. That was when the door to his office burst open without warning, shattering the fragile quiet he had been holding on to. Thomas, Nora, and Lucy stepped in almost at once, their energy spilling into the room in a way that immediately shifted the atmosphere. Lucy was speaking before the door had even closed behind them, her words tumbling over each other with urgency that left no room for pleasantries. "Drew, we're sorry to bother you, but we think something bad may have happened to Lizzie," she said, her voice tight with anxiety as she crossed the room. "There's no way this is her responding to my texts." She held her phone out toward him, her hand slightly unsteady, and he took it without speaking, his eyes moving quickly across the screen. The three of them stood in front of his desk, watching him closely, their expressions a mixture of fear and expectation that made the room feel suddenly smaller. He scanned the messages once, then again, letting the words settle into place, and when he looked up, his gaze landed hard on Thomas. The look was enough to communicate everything he was thinking without a single word spoken, and Thomas immediately dropped his eyes, his posture tightening under the weight of it. Drew didn't need an explanation to know that something had been shared that shouldn't have been, that his instructions had not been followed as clearly as he had intended. Before he could press the point, Nora stepped forward, her voice steady, but carrying a note of accountability. "This is my fault," she said quickly, her hands lifting slightly as if to take the blame before it could be. Assigned elsewhere. "I told Lucy we were just trying to figure out what's going on to help, but you need to see this." Her words were careful but firm, and though she didn't raise her voice, there was a quiet insistence in it that demanded his attention. Drew exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers moving almost unconsciously to his mustache, stroking it as he processed both the situation and the breach of his directive. "And who told you, Nora?" he asked, his tone measured but edged with frustration. He wasn't just looking for an answer. He was peeling back the layers, trying to understand how far the information had spread and where the breakdown had begun. Thomas swallowed, then stepped forward despite the tension hanging between them. "I mentioned it to Nora when it first happened," he said, his voice steady but subdued. "Sir, I didn't realize at the time that we needed to keep it quiet." He paused briefly, then added, "I understand now." Drew nodded once, though the gesture carried more weight than agreement, his expression firm as he responded. "Things like this stay contained," he said, his voice taking on the tone he reserved for moments that required clarity above all else. "Some matters are private, and the entire newsroom doesn't need to be part of them." He let the words settle, then added, "Thomas, we'll discuss this further later." The room held still for a moment, the tension easing only slightly as he shifted his focus back to the phone in his hand. "Now," he continued, "what exactly am I supposed to be looking at?" Lucy leaned forward, pointing to the message thread, her movements quick and precise. "This text about Susan and Frank," she said, her voice quieter now but no less urgent. Drew's brow furrowed slightly as he read the names again, then glanced up. "Who are Susan and Frank?" he asked. The question, simple but direct. "They're my parents," Nora replied, her tone steady. "But Steph doesn't know that. We made the names up to see how she would respond." She hesitated briefly, then added, "We think someone else might have her phone." Drew blinked, the statement catching him off guard in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice tightening slightly. "You think someone is using her phone and pretending to be her?" Lucy and Nora nodded almost in unison, their expressions reflecting the seriousness of what they were suggesting. Thomas remained quiet, his eyes moving between them, absorbing the exchange without adding to it. "Sit down," Drew said, his tone shifting into something calmer, steadier, the voice he used when guiding others through uncertainty. "Let's think this through carefully." The three of them took seats across from his desk, their posture tense, their attention fixed on him as if waiting for him to make sense of what they could not. "Let's start with what we know," he continued, leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on the desk. "It's possible Lizzie knows a Susan and Frank that we don't. That would make her response logical from her perspective." He paused, letting the reasoning take shape, even as doubt lingered beneath it. "She was at the conference, so are you suggesting something happened to her after that?" "Yes," Lucy said immediately, her voice firm despite the uncertainty in her eyes. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Drew nodded slowly, though his thoughts were already moving ahead, trying to reconcile the information he had gathered with the possibility they were presenting. His mind circled back to his conversation with Dennis, to the idea that Lizzie had met someone, that she might be choosing distance rather than being forced into it. There were plausible explanations that didn't involve anything sinister, explanations that aligned with human behavior rather than something darker. But the alternative, the one Lucy and Nora were hinting at, lingered in the background, difficult to dismiss entirely. "If you're right," he said carefully, "we need more than suspicion. We need something that confirms it." The room grew quiet again, each of them considering what that might look like. Then Lucy leaned forward suddenly, her eyes lighting with a new idea. "She only has one sister, right?" she said, looking between them. "What if we mention a brother in a text and see how she responds?" The suggestion hung in the air, simple but effective, and all three of them turned their attention back to Drew. Thomas gave a small nod. Nora followed with a more emphatic one, and the room seemed to settle into a collective expectation. Drew hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew more than they did, knew that Lizzie might simply be involved with someone and choosing to keep that part of her life separate, but he also couldn't ignore the possibility that something was wrong. "All right," he said finally, the word coming out slower than he intended. "Try it." Lucy moved, immediately her fingers flying across the screen as she typed. Then she read the message aloud, her voice slightly unsteady. "Your brother stopped by to invite you to lunch while you're out. He said he'd call you to set it up." She looked up, her gaze moving from one face to the next. "If it's really her, she'll correct it," she said. Drew nodded once. "Send it." She took a breath, her finger hovering for a fraction of a second before pressing down. The message disappeared into the thread, and all four of them leaned forward instinctively, their attention fixed on the screen. The room fell into a deep, expectant silence, broken only by the faint sound of a car passing outside. Lucy stared at the phone, her hand beginning to tremble slightly as the seconds stretched. "Nothing yet," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Drew leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. "It might take time," he said, though his own patience was wearing thin. He was just about to suggest they return to their duties when Lucy's posture changed abruptly. "Wait," she said sharply, her eyes widening. "The typing bubbles are there." The words pulled all of them forward again, their focus narrowing to that small blinking indication of a response in progress. The silence deepened, becoming almost tangible as they watched the screen. Lucy's hand shook more noticeably now, her breath coming slightly faster. "It's taking a long time," she whispered, her voice carrying a mix of anticipation and dread. Nora leaned closer, her face tightening as she watched the same small movement. Drew felt his throat go dry, the moment stretching into something that felt larger than it should have been. When the message finally appeared, Lucy and Nora reacted almost at the same time, their expression shifting into something he couldn't immediately interpret. "What does it say?" Drew asked, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. Lucy swallowed, her voice thin as she read it. "It says, 'Okay, thanks.'" The simplicity of it hit harder than any elaborate response could have, the absence of correction confirming what none of them wanted to fully accept. Thomas leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair, while Nora's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. A cold sensation crept up Drew's spine, settling into a quiet certainty that something was deeply wrong. Lucy didn't stop, her fingers already moving again, typing another message before anyone could intervene. Drew watched her for a moment, then asked, "What did you send?" She handed him the phone, and he read the text aloud, his voice measured. "I know you have a couple of brothers. This was the youngest one. I forgot his name. What is it again?" Lucy leaned forward, her voice steadier now despite the fear underlying it. "She doesn't have any brothers," she said. "I want to see how she responds." They waited again, the seconds, dragging into minutes, each one amplifying the tension in the room. The read receipt appeared, confirming the message had been seen, but no reply followed. Lucy typed once more, adding another line, pressing further, trying to provoke something that might reveal the truth. "She should be calling me out by now," Lucy said, her voice rising slightly. "She'd think I lost my mind." The minutes passed, heavy and unyielding, and still there was nothing. The absence of response felt louder than anything that could have been said. "Something is really wrong," Lucy said finally, her voice breaking, slightly as she looked at the others. She hesitated for only a moment before typing again, her words simple and direct. "Steph, are you okay?" She read it aloud before sending it, her voice trembling just enough to betray how much was riding on those few words. The message went through, and they waited, their attention fixed on the screen, as if willing it to respond. Drew felt a small twitch in his thumb, a familiar sign of tension he couldn't fully suppress. No response came, not immediately, not after a minute, not after several. The silence settled heavily over the room, each of them, feeling it in their own way, the realization forming without needing to be spoken. They looked at one another, and in that shared glance, something unspoken passed between them. Somehow, without a single definitive answer, they all understood the same thing at once. Whatever was happening, it was not normal, and it was not safe. And in that quiet, heavy moment, the certainty took hold that this was very, very bad. Chapter 20. Dennis. The Tuesday after the flight, it was snowing when I woke up, but not the kind of snow that makes the world feel clean or magical. It came down in slow, tired flakes that seemed to melt the moment they touched anything, turning sidewalks into a gray, slushy mess that carried none of winter's usual beauty. The sky outside my bedroom window hung low and heavy, pressing down on the day before it even had a chance to begin. I lay there for a moment, staring at it, already feeling the weight of something I couldn't quite name settling into my chest. I knew what the forecast had said, that a deep freeze would sweep in later that night and lock everything in place, turning that wet mess into something dangerous. The front walk would become a sheet of ice if I didn't take care of it, and the thought of stepping out there later without salt made me wince. I sighed, already adding the task to the growing list in my head, and then, almost without meaning to, added Steph's walkway to it as well. It felt automatic, the kind of thing you do when someone you care about isn't there to do it themselves. The thought of her lingered longer than the weather, settling into something more complicated than simple concern. She had been acting like a giddy schoolgirl lately, swept up in something new and intoxicating, and I couldn't decide whether that made me happy for her or deeply uncomfortable. There was something about it, that didn't sit right, something that felt out of step with the woman I thought I knew. Still, I tried to push that aside, reminding myself that people were allowed to change, even if the change didn't make sense to me. I reached for my glasses on the bedside table, the familiar weight settling onto my face as I blinked into focus. My phone lay beside them, dark and silent, until I picked it up and saw the notification waiting for me, a text from Steph. The sight of her name sent a small spark through me, something hopeful and anticipatory, and I opened it immediately, already bracing myself for something playful or overly affectionate. What I saw instead stopped me. Cold. I'm typing this while Trent is sleeping. I think I might come home earlier than expected. Remember how I said he was bossy? Well, he actually yelled at me. It scared me. His anger came out of nowhere. He doesn't like it when I contact people from home. I'll call you when I can. For a moment, my body didn't react at all, as if my brain needed time to catch up to what my eyes had just read. Then everything hit at once, my heart stuttering, my throat tightening until it felt like I couldn't pull in a full breath. The words didn't just sit on the screen. They pressed into me, carrying fear that felt raw and immediate. I could almost hear her voice behind them, not the confident, easy tone I was used to, but something quieter, something strained. My fingers moved before I could fully process it, tapping out a response, in a rush that felt more like instinct than thought. Oh my God, are you okay? What's happening? Do you need help? The questions tumbled out, each one heavier than the last, and I hit send without rereading them, desperate for any kind of reply. I stared at the screen, waiting for the read receipt to appear, but it stayed stubbornly on delivered, as if the message had gone somewhere it wasn't meant to reach. I typed again, faster this time, the urgency spilling into every letter. Steph, please answer. The silence that followed felt louder than anything, stretching the seconds into something unbearable. I tried once more, my thoughts racing ahead of my words. If you don't text me back soon, I'm calling 911. The reply came just as I was starting to think it wouldn't. I'm okay for now. He seems to have settled down this morning. I'm going to book a flight. I'll be in touch. The words offered some relief, but it was thin, fragile, the kind that cracked under the slightest pressure. I could feel the panic still humming beneath the surface, refusing to quiet down. Come home now, I typed back immediately. Can I call you? Can I? Talk to you. I waited, my breath shallow, my body tense in a way that made it hard to stay still. When the response came, it was shorter, sharper. No, not right now. I have to go. He's coming. The words hit like a physical blow, something primal rising up inside me that I had never felt so clearly before. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something instinctive that bypassed reason entirely. He's coming. The phrase echoed in my mind, carrying with it an image I didn't want, but couldn't stop forming. I threw the covers back and got out of bed so quickly I nearly lost my balance, my body moving before I had any plan. I started pacing the room, my bare feet cold against the floor, my thoughts racing in circles that led nowhere. She was hundreds of miles away, in a different city, in a place I couldn't reach, and the distance felt unbearable. I couldn't eat, couldn't sit, couldn't focus on anything that wasn't her. The entire morning dissolved into a blur of movement and worry, my mind replaying her words over and over again. The idea of her being with someone who could turn on her like that, someone who could frighten her into silence, made my chest tighten in a way that felt almost painful. Eventually, I couldn't stand being in my own space anymore, so I grabbed my keys and went next door to her place. Lenny greeted me with a soft, questioning sound, weaving around my legs as I moved through the house. I fed him automatically, my hands moving through the motions while my thoughts stayed elsewhere. Then I started pacing her home the way I had been pacing mine, moving from room to room without any real direction. After what felt like the 10th pass by her row of plants, something in me paused, a sudden thought taking hold. I looked around more carefully, as if the answers might be hidden somewhere in the quiet order of her life. The first floor was exactly as I expected, tidy and organized, everything in its place. I opened a few cabinets in the kitchen, finding nothing but neatly stacked dishes and the familiar signs of someone who kept things simple. The refrigerator held a few magnets from the station, small reminders of work that now felt distant and unimportant. Upstairs, the guest room was just as unremarkable, a bed made with care, extra linens folded neatly in the closet. The bathroom held the usual items, nothing out of place, nothing that hinted at anything unusual. When I stepped into her bedroom, the slight disorder there felt more personal. The half-open drawers, the clothes scattered just enough to suggest she had been in a hurry. I reached out and touched a blue shirt hanging in her closet, something I had always liked on her, the fabric soft under my fingers. That was when my phone vibrated in my pocket, the sudden movement jolting me back into the moment. I pulled it out quickly, my breath catching as I saw her name again. Dennis, he hit me. He hit me hard. I'm scared. I think he's going to kill me. Everything that followed happened in fragments, my body moving faster than my mind could keep up. I turned toward the door too quickly, my foot catching on the edge of the step as I rushed down the stairs. Pain shot through my knee as I stumbled, and the phone slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a sharp crack that made my heart lurch. For a split second, a new fear took hold, one that felt almost absurd in comparison, but no less real. If the phone was broken, I had no way to call for help. I dropped to the floor, my hands shaking so badly I could barely pick it up, my breath coming in uneven bursts. The screen lit up, cracked but functional, and relief washed over me so suddenly it almost made me dizzy. My fingers fumbled as I dialed, pressing the numbers I never wanted to use. The phone rang once, then connected, and a calm voice answered on the other end. 911, what's your emergency? My friend is in trouble, I said, my voice unsteady, the words tumbling over each other. She texted me that a man is trying to kill her, someone she's been seeing. His name is Trent. My throat felt tight, the words coming out rough, but I forced myself to keep going. Sir, calm down. Where is her last known location? She's in Atlanta, I said, my voice shaking. It was a work trip, and she met this guy there. I paused, trying to think, trying to pull something useful from the chaos in my head. Do you know where in Atlanta? For a moment I thought I didn't, panic rising again, until something clicked. Wait, I said quickly. Yes, she sent me his address. I put the call on speaker and scrolled through our messages, my hands still trembling. There it was, buried among earlier texts, a photo of his condo and the address she had sent. 4240 Horizon Lane, I read out loud. Peachtree Village. We're contacting Atlanta police now, the operator said. What is your name? Dennis Frazier. We have your number, Dennis. Someone will call you if needed. Please hurry, I said, the words coming out as more of a plea than a statement. Please. When the call ended, the silence that followed felt overwhelming, and I sank onto the bottom step, my body finally giving in to the shock. My breath came in uneven pulls, my chest tight, my vision blurring as tears filled my eyes. Then I realized something that made my stomach drop. I hadn't responded to her. I had been so focused on calling for help that I hadn't said anything back. I called her immediately, the phone ringing once before going straight to voicemail. I tried again, then again, each attempt ending the same way. "Oh, Steph," I whispered, the words barely audible. I sent a text instead. I called 911. They are on their way. Call me. There was no response, hitting me as I moved, my thoughts spiraling. I wanted to throw the phone, to break something, to release the pressure building inside me, but I knew I couldn't risk losing it. Instead, I grabbed the nearest pillows and hurled them across the room, shouting without words. The energy burned out quickly, leaving me hollow, and I collapsed onto the couch, curling into myself as the tears finally came. I didn't try to stop them. For a moment, I let myself feel everything: the fear, the helplessness, the crushing distance between where I was and where she needed me to be. When the phone rang again, I lunged for it, hope flaring briefly, only to see it wasn't her. It was Drew. I answered anyway, my voice breaking as I spoke. "I don't know what's happening," I said, the words spilling out. "She texted me that this guy might kill her. I called 911. Now she's not answering." There was a pause. Then Drew's voice came through, more serious than I had ever heard it. "Dennis, we need to talk. Can you come to Channel 3? "I'll be there," I said, already moving, grabbing my coat without thinking. As I stepped out the door, the cold air hit me again, sharper now, and for the first time I felt the full weight of what might already be too late.